Well, thank you everybody for joining. We are really looking forward to this webinar. We typically do a lead up of webinar series in preparation for our RESI conferences, and we're really excited this time to have a guest speaker with us. So I will quickly introduce myself before turning it over to Bruce. But I am Max Braht. I lead the business development team here at Life Science Nation. I also work primarily with companies based on the East Coast. I myself am located in Boston, so I get the opportunity to work with companies not only to get them onboarded with our RESI conference and our investor database, but really to help them approach fundraising in general. And a lot of what we do at LSN is designed to help companies on the 9 to 18 months that kind of follow, and that fundraising isn't just a singular conference, but a roadshow that follows. So we help them in that regard. Bruce?
Hi, everybody. Bruce Cohen. I am a part-time venture partner with Zariah Capital, which is the life science investment unit of the Malaysian Government Sovereign Fund. And I am also the CEO of a drug delivery startup called Buckle Therapeutics, which has developed novel technology for the delivery of drugs through the buccal mucosa, which gives you the kinetics of an intramuscular injection, but without needles. And I've had the pleasure for at least the past decade of being on both sides of the table, being an entrepreneur and uh, I guess an inventor, and also at the same time getting a chance to look at lots of companies on behalf of a venture fund. So I'm a regular at RESI as a judge and sitting on pitch contests. And I am a recent alum of having pitched my company at a recent RESI meeting. So,
Yeah,
um,
look, Bruce has been on both sides of the spectrum. So he has joined us for numerous IPCs as an investor judge, but just recently at Resi Boston June, came and he pitched as part of the IPC track. So Bruce, we're really looking forward to it because again, that this webinar itself is focused on tips on pitching. So having done both sides of it, I think you provide a really unique perspective. And it looks like a majority of the people in the audience are representing early stage companies themselves. So probably those that have either signed up to pitch at Resi Boston September already or are considering doing so. One of the good things about this webinar is I think a lot of the things that you and I will discuss are applicable to not just the IPC pitch track, but also Resi and Resi partnering in general. So I know we will first go ahead and kind of get started. I will do the quick intro to LSN for anybody that is new. And then we'll get started kind of going over the specifics of Resi IPC and then what makes a good presentation, as well as not just the pitch presentation, but also general tips and recommendations we have for messaging within a partner system. Bruce and I had a prep call yesterday and we had an interesting discussion about that. So I'm looking forward to it. And then we'll finish with how to prepare for some investor questions, because that is always the hard part. And for me, who has had the opportunity to sit in on many of sessions, probably one of my favorite parts. Um, so to start, for anyone who does not know LSN and what we do, we really have three main categories in which we help companies connect with investors. What we're going to focus on today is that middle row, the Resi Partnering Conference. That is a global partnering event where we will typically bring between 400 to 450 investors and strategic licensing partners together to partner with early stage life science companies. And that goes throughout therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, digital health. But what we do that is unique is we vet these investors really thoroughly. Um, and when we do that, we get to ensure not only the quality of the investors attending Resi, but it also helps us build out our investor database that we offer. That database houses information on allocation information, sectors, subsectors, indications, all of this interest for the investor, where companies can then go in there and filter it down to find investors that are actually a fit for their product and their stage of development. And then the last and final thing that we offer is entrepreneurial education. So I briefly kind of alluded to this earlier, but at LSM Labs, our incubator space, we kind of pride ourselves on picking up where a lot of incubators leave off. And that goes into the concept of the 9 to 18 months that follow. We know a lot of groups out there who are really great at teaching the pitch deck and teaching how do you approach a partnering event, but they don't teach the BD and sales 101 that it takes to be successful in a fundraise. And so a lot of our products are revolved around giving the entrepreneur not only the product to be able to effectively approach a fundraising show, but also a product that helps them do it effectively. Um, and so we go through a lot of that in our bootcamp sessions in the entrepreneurial education. And so RESI, what it is, I kind of briefly said this earlier, but it is a mix of what we say the four Ds. So drugs, devices, diagnostics, and digital health. And that is true not just of the companies in attendance, but also of the investors. So a lot of the investors at the early stage, we like to classify as anything from seed through Series B. So if you are a company out there fundraising between 500,000 to 50 million, you kind of fall within scope of a lot of the investors we see. And so we will work with angels, family offices, venture capital, private equity, hedge funds, governments, endowments, foundations. We track 10 different investor types. So if they write a check and they're interested in early stage life science, we will work with them. And so we invite all of these people to join us at RESI. And specifically, one of the key components of RESI, outside of the partnering, and what this webinar is going to focus on is obviously the pitch track. So at RESI, we pride it on being both a mix of partnering, where our previous event, Resi Boston June, had over 2,000 meetings between startup and investor, but we also put together a great track of programming. So we have investor panels going on, we have educational boot camps, and then we also have our Innovators Pitch Challenge. So the IPC gives startups the opportunity to go and pitch directly to a panel of sector-specific investor judges, which Bruce has served on many times. It is a 6-minute pitch, 7-minute Q&A, and applicable to any of these following groups you see on the screen. And the reason we say that is because we do put together a panel of sector specific. So when every investor signs up to attend Resi, we interview them, and we get to find out exactly where their fund is allocating their capital, which not only gets imported into our partnering ontology, so that when you filter down in partnering, you actually know who's a fit and who isn't a fit. But we also then are able to put together a panel of investor judges that each represent funds that are investing in the sectors of the pitching companies. And then, of course, we also invite all other investors to kind of fill the room. So it really is a great opportunity for the pitching companies to not only increase their exposure at Resi, but also just to pitch directly to funds that are in their space. I've kind of skimmed over the format now a little bit, but the pitch package includes two 3-day registrations. It includes a in-person pitch slot, as well as both an exhibition table and a poster space. So again, now with two registrations, this is actually new from what we did in June, but we have found in our feedback from entrepreneurs who have attended and pitched in the past is that with a table and a poster space, it is a huge and a great opportunity to connect with the investors that pass by. However, if you're in partnering meetings all day and you're not there, it doesn't really do much good. So we included an additional registration. That way, pitching companies can now come and maximize their exposure by bringing two registrants. Um, the investor judges who are serving on the panel also do give written feedback, which is a great opportunity not just to hear feedback on your pitch and hear what you were doing right and what you're doing wrong, but also to hear feedback on kind of how you answer the Q&A portion. And at the very least, it gives you a really good idea of how you should approach investor meetings. If you go up there and 5 to 6 investors are all asking you kind of the same question, um, it's probably something that you should start to address, right? And then also we've kind of gamified it a bit and introduced Resi Cash, which we are now bringing back, which allows all of the attendees to vote on their favorite pitching company. And so I know 6 minutes is quick. Um, Again, it is not supposed to be a first meeting. We kind of like to call it the movie trailer. So it is just enough time to cover all of these key elements kind of at a high level. You should touch on your technology, the market, the unmet need that you're addressing, how you're differentiated within the market, especially in comparison to some of your competitors, any milestones that you've achieved, whether those are data inflection points or key rounds of previous funding, and then anything else that you find important, especially the management team. Whenever I listen to pitching companies pitch and they don't address their management team, and Bruce, I'm sure you can vouch for this, but it is almost always the first question asked, right? And so for Resi Boston September, our upcoming event, it is taking place September 17th in person. The pitch applications are now open. They are set to close Wednesday, August 6th. However, I will warn anyone who is considering doing it. We almost always fill these spots early. So we highly recommend that if you are interested in pitching, please either reach out to our team for more information, or we just have the URL down there. You can go ahead and submit your application now. That way you have ensured that you have a spot and that you are have enough time to update your materials and be prepared for when partnering opens, which will be early to mid-August. So again, we highly encourage all of the companies out there to probably do this early, just to ensure you get a spot. Nice. And so that covers all of the IPC housekeeping. Bruce, we can now start to go in to a little bit more of the tips. And before we dive into the tips that we have specifically for pitching, I want to talk about the tips that we have for approaching a partnering conference in general. And one of the themes that Bruce and I got to talk about yesterday was what makes a good intro message versus what makes a bad one. Because the important thing to note, and what we try to tie everything back to, is that as a entrepreneur and as a company, all of your messaging, both in partnering platforms as well as your marketing collateral, should have one key goal, which is to make it as easy as possible for an investor to say yes to a meeting, and nothing else. In order to do so, obviously, you have to convey information and show why your company is compelling. But for a lot of companies, if they can always tie back to making it easy to get a first meeting, that is a good note to kind of keep in mind. So, what we recommend doing is obviously introduce your company, um, where you're based, what sector you're in, the indication, the development, the key differentiation, but don't go into too much depth. And also, one of the jokes that Bruce, I'll let you talk about this here in a second because you have probably a very interesting perspective, having seen a lot of incoming messages, is investors are busy. So it is really important to be able to, in a few sentences, convey your message. Bruce, is there anything that you want to add to that note?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me, Max, and thanks to all of you for listening. I want to sort of start with a couple of global comments that may be obvious, but I think they're worth highlighting here. One is that the number of companies looking for money is growing faster than the number of funds that are distributing money. And that plus some changes in technology have made it very easy for people to request a lot of meetings. So for an average Resi, I will get between 150 and 250 requests for meetings. And oftentimes Resi has sessions, as it does in September, at the same time of year as there are other conferences in proximity. So it's important to step back for a second before you write your introductory email to realize that the person on the other side may be really busy or may just pretending to be busy, but is going to have to go through a lot of these emails. So you should think about your pitch as something that is never longer than what fits on the screen of an iPhone, because no one at this level of screening has the time to go down and down and down to find out where the punchline is. And so that means it's obvious, but if you put yourself on the other side of having to look through a couple hundred of these, or if there's three in the same week, 1,000 of them, you want to get to the point fast. It's not like a movie where the reveal comes at the end. And tactically, one of my pet peeves and one of the peeves a lot of my friends say is telling us what your name is and what the name of your company is redundant at this point because the text starts right below where the RESI system tells us what your name is and what the company is. And so you've wasted 3 or 4 lines of text on a very short attention span. And you need to get to everything immediately. And I know that's a little bit of an oxymoron, but we need to know what it is you do, what your product is, why we should care about it. And a lot of people are really now pushing back and saying, tell me how much money you're raising, because funds have different rules and they're not going to change their rules about how much they're willing to allocate per investment, no matter how much they fall in love with you or your company. You don't have to talk about valuation at the beginning. We'll talk about that in the Q&A part, I guess, Max, is you have to have an answer for that question, but not in the initial pitch.
So one thing that you had mentioned in there that stood out to me was the concept of immediately addressing how much you're raising.
Hmm.
We recommend it too, but oftentimes we hear companies who their hesitancy to put it in their initial message because they say that maybe they're not sure. They say we could raise 3 million, we could raise 5, we could raise 10, or we can do it with less. What are your thoughts? And I know you had kind of briefly alluded to the fact that you prefer to see it, but what are your thoughts about companies who may not have an exact ask and their ability to put it in their messaging?
So I should have opened my comments with saying that the investment process is quite idiosyncratic on the side of the investor. And so people have their preferences. Um, for the most part, if you're going to play to the majority of the crowd, you have to have a number.
Mhm.
Because if the investor likes the company and the number is too high, it's easy for them to come back and say, what can you do with less? Or are you open to having a tranched financing? Which the answer to that question, by the way, is always yes. Um, what you don't want to do is communicate a lack of commitment. I'll see what the audience likes. This isn't a screening test for a movie where you haven't finished making the end scene yet. So for most people, the older or more mature they get in the investment process, they need to know that. And they're perfectly capable of saying, you're going to get through a phase 3 study on $2.7 million. No, no one's going to believe that. But you have to say, I'm raising 5 million or I'm raising a million, because the distinction between what's a seed and a series A, or this new thing called pre-seed, has means that your definition of the phase no longer has meaning with regard to how much you're raising. And some people can't write a $5 million check, and some people can't make a $200,000 check work. And so you got to know that if they like what you're selling, they'll figure out how to solve the problem, or they'll just say, no, we can't write a check that small or that big.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm not going to spend my time reading this out. For everyone, I should have addressed this earlier, but A, this session is being recorded, and we will also redistribute the slides earlier. But this is just a quick example of a good message. And you can see at a high level that it touches not repetitively on the name of the person and the name of the company, but it spends a majority of its time talking about what differentiates between competitors. It talks on key milestones and a lot of the points that we had said earlier. So we recommend having some sort of template like this that you can work from. And again, we'll send this out so that everyone watching can go and look at these slides later. Um, in the concept of a RESI meeting and any partnering meeting in general, it is no surprise that companies who send more meeting requests will book more meetings. But you do have to walk the fine line of just because that's the case does not mean you should be reaching out to everyone. You should only be reaching out to those investors that are actually a fit with your product, stage of development, and capital ask. If you can do so, and if there's a system in place, which the Resi Partnering Portal has, to be able to filter down the investors to find that select group, we recommend reaching out to them. Um, and not just reaching out one time, but being consistent with your follow-ups. Companies who can do that, they effectively will always get more meetings. We have a system in place where you send your first message that we just discussed, wait a week, and then you literally put second request, and then you provide a little bit more information on one particular aspect of your company, whether it be the technology, the management team, key milestones, and then you wait a few days, and then third request, same thing, and then wait a few days, and then you do fourth and final request. That way, you are not continuously bombarding them, but you've now given them a continuously more compelling information, and you've also brought it back to the top of their inbox. That way, when investors log on, and it is always later rather than sooner, they always log in and get active in partnering with about 2 weeks left. And that way, you just ensure that you're kind of at the top of their page. So now moving on a little bit more specifically to the pitch track, and some messaging tips that we have specifically for the pitch and for the IPC at RESI is one, clearly describe your technology, right? This ties back into a concept that we have of a slogan versus a tagline. A slogan provides a bunch of buzzwords, like you can see here in the first example. My company has a proprietary treatment for many critical illnesses. It sounds good, but we have no idea what it means. Um, you need to be much more specific, and we fix it up to say we are developing an IND-ready small molecule asset for breast cancer by activating natural killer cells. This not only touches on modality, indication, market, and the differentiation in a way that an investor will immediately know if they want to take a meeting with you or not. Um, Investors know if they invest in small molecules or if they don't. And that is true with any other type of science out there. So if it's not a fit, hiding information is not going to make it a fit. It is important to effectively communicate it, and that way an investor can either say yes or say no. Um, but it's better than getting no response, and it's better than kind of stringing an investor on. Um, the second tip we have is to be realistic with your statements. We make it a joke, but you'd be surprised by how often we see it. Companies who go up and say we have no competitors, what we're doing is completely unique. And in some cases, yeah, you may be first in class, you may be best in class, but there is always some sort of competition, whether it is vertically or horizontally. And saying you have no competitors doesn't communicate the point that you're differentiated. What it does is it communicates the point that you don't necessarily know your market well. Um, and every investor wants to see an entrepreneur and a company have a deep, deep understanding of their market because that is one of the most important things that's going to dictate success or not. So it is important to be realistic, not just with competition, but also timeline you have for key milestones, and importantly, also the capital required to achieve those inflection points. So on that note, Bruce, I am curious to hear from you. What are some of the common pitfalls you see when companies try explaining their platform or their mechanism of action? And Bruce, I think you've muted yourself.
I indeed did because I have construction noise. My apologies. I think when you look at all of the pitches you're going to see, um, the most common pitfall is it takes too long to get to the point. And I want to be careful how I frame this, right? The reason that you started this company um, is something that is a very high risk thing to open with because a lot of people aren't concerned about why you decided to invest in um, triple negative breast cancer, right? Because it could be that it's where the technology came with, it could be because of your assessment of the market. But the fact that you lost someone tragically to a disease takes too much time to tell the story and doesn't really change the way the investor feels about the business because that story becomes irrelevant when you're partnering it or raising the amount of money you need to do a phase 3 trial. So there are a lot of things people do to tell you stories about themselves, tell you stories about their interest in the disease, so on and so forth. Go back into the detail about how some great scientists discovered this in a lab by accident. None of that stuff matters, and it just has people sitting in the audience, if they're investors, kind of tapping their thumbs, going, "When are they getting to the point?" So it's the slow open that can be devastating. And if your native language is not English, it takes longer to tell the story. So you've lost a lot of time. And right? RESI doesn't give you more time to tell your story if you're not a native speaker of English, right? You get the same 6 minutes that everybody else gets. So you have to look at yourself and practice that pitch and make sure that in the first minute you've gotten the point out as to what you're doing, because that then is going to intrigue the investor to listen to the next 5 or 6 minutes. And so be real careful about how long it takes you to get there. And when I do my scoring and stuff, the most common thing I write is took too long to get to the point.
So to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, one of the pitfalls that we see most commonly are companies will often take too long to get to the point. But what takes a long time is they go in depth with data and they show all of their scientific data before they really get to, again, as you say, that the point of it. And so my second question is, how do you kind of balance showing data and showing the results of tests versus just explaining the technology? Especially when an investor audience has different technical experiences and technical knowledge. How should a company approach that?
So unless you're pitching to family offices, right, which tend to have smaller staffs or no staffs, and then you're taking a risk that they don't understand the basic biology or the chemistry. Um, Most folks aren't interested because they're trained or they've seen 1,000 pitches before. The advice I give to people is one data slide max.
Mhm.
And whether that's a table or a graph or a PK curve or something, only one. And it can't come in the first two slides. The first slide has to be why we should care about this. The second slide has to be what you're doing. And the third slide has to be why it works. And the details of what molecules you're touching, how this sort of interacts at the intracellular level and all that stuff. Those are diligence questions. You want to see data, and if it's from a rat, it's from a rat that says this curve that the naked eye can see is better than that curve. And that's all you want to say. And the point is not to do in a sort of the equivalence of a poster session at ASCO. The point is to say, we have the data. And most investors will take that on faith at the first meeting, and then they'll do diligence on it. And I think it's really important, Max, we talked about this yesterday, what belongs in a pitch and what belongs in diligence,
Yeah.
right? So when you get to IP, you want to have issued patent or patents, but I don't think you want to have a list of the claim language. And I sure as hell don't want to see a review of prior art. Those are diligence questions.
Mhm. So outside, and I know I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but outside of intellectual property and technology, what else do you think absolutely belongs in a pitch versus in diligence?
My second favorite subject is how you're going to make money. And that's a rare thing, as sad as it is to say. And I want to draw a distinction. One of my colleagues and I, Zerai, just had this conversation this morning. If you're developing a new drug for rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or whatever, certain kinds of cancer for sure, um, how you make money is obvious. You're going to get to charge an awful lot for a drug that doesn't cost that much to make. But in any other sector, your investors are going to want to know how you're going to make money. And you have to get to that before the end. It doesn't need to be on the first slide, but you need to have a realistic assessment of how many patients, how much they're going to pay, and as Max said, who the competition is or what you're displacing. And sometimes, right, the competition is another company. Sometimes you're displacing a whole set of technologies. But the closer you get to devices and diagnostics, we need to know how you're going to make money. And if you're, I don't think there's anybody on this, but if you're in something like ag bio, that has to come at the beginning because the economics will destroy the company there immediately. And I think too few people want to talk about that particularly if they're scientifically trained, because that's not part of the scientific training program, just to think about what your cost of goods is, how many units you have to sell, and so on and so forth. Not a detailed marketing plan, but and please, it's not a billion patients and not $1 trillion TAM.
Yeah. What do you think about the management team? Is that how in depth should a company explain their team?
I think we differ on that, Max. Because if you're the CEO for sure, the bet's on you.
Yeah.
And the presumption is you may or may not have the perfect team in place, but all I care about is there's one other person who you can talk to, because there's nothing worse than flying solo. Um, I think people tend to over pitch the team rather than under pitch it, because to me that comes up on diligence. And then it's a diligence question only insofar as it says, hey, this person has to hire a bunch of senior people. They don't have them. So let me make sure there's money in the budget for that. But I'm particularly cynical about the scientific advisory board, the medical advisory board, the who your attorneys are, who does your IP. I know people ask those questions. I'm not sure, do I care if you're using Cooley or a reasonable local law firm? No, not really, because when the time comes, you'll have to be with a national firm. And do I care that you have somebody who's a highly recognized scientist who's agreed to advise you? It could be your brother-in-law for all I know. And and so I find that information less predictive as to the outcome of the success of the business. I want to know who you are, and I want to know you're either the number two because the CEO is unavailable, or you have a number two that's a thought partner,
Mhm.
because you're going to need that internally. We'd like to think all your board members are thought partners, but most board members are too busy to do that, or don't have operational experience. So I want to see maybe one or two names, but some people want to see, right, Max? I think your best practices suggest we see the whole team. I never recommend people open with that.
Yeah. Awesome. And we do recommend showing the team. But again,
Yeah,
it's not necessarily something you need to go in depth on. In the sense that you don't need to explain where each of your team members went to their training, got their university degree. If you show them, I think that's sufficient. Especially in a pitch. The person pitching is always the most important, which is
right. And increasingly, if you're a little on the older side, you want your investors to know you believe in succession planning, or if you skydive for a hobby, that the company, an early stage company, will collapse if the founding team or the founding CEO gets hit by a bus.
yeah.
And unfortunately, we've had that experience in our portfolio. Not died, but was disabled for some time because it was an automobile accident. And
Oh.
right.
So our next few sets of tips, tips 3 and 4 are going to be to cover all aspects of your company. And I know we kind of just dove into this a little bit, but what are the important things that belong in a pitch at a high level versus in diligence? And now here seeing the list, I do want to ask you a little bit more specifically about competition. When a company addresses competition, what are some of the best ways and the best information that you think is important to do so?
Um, I think you made the most important point before,
Yeah,
Max. Is
what's
you
important
have,
for them to address?
yeah. So you have to, if you say there is none, you just look silly.
Hmm.
And, and looking silly usually doesn't win a pitch contest or a lot of funding. Um, I want to see two or three very pithy benefits of what you're selling versus the competition. And those, I mean, I don't want to trivialize it, but you have to think about that benefit in terms of the customer. So if you've got a device that's going to speed up the workflow in a multi-physician office practice, that's really important. But you need to relate that to, is the person who benefits from this the decision maker? Because if it's two steps removed from the decision maker,
Hmm.
then I'm not persuaded you're going to get penetration, right? So if it's a drug, it has to outperform best in class, or it has to have fewer side effects, which isn't as big a deal as it used to be, just because of the way reimbursement works these days. If it's a diagnostic, it has to be meaningfully faster. I'll just give you one quick example. About 5 or 6 years ago, everybody was doing rapid PCR until somebody said, there's no difference between 4 hours and 2 hours. They're both outside the window of the office visit. So cutting the turnaround on a PCR assay doesn't matter if the patient's already gone home. And whether she's left 20 minutes ago or an hour ago, she's not there anymore. And those guys who remember, please, I hope there's nobody on the call who wants to do rapid chlamydia testing. If the patient's left the office, it doesn't matter how fast it is. And so you want to think about workflow. You want to think about who is going to make that call and how it's going to make their life better. Unfortunately, it's usually not the patient,
Yeah.
right? And so doctors these days don't have the time to change the practice of medicine for what they might regard as a marginal increase in efficiency or even patient outcomes. They will wait until it becomes standard of care. And if everybody's waiting for it to become the standard of care, nobody's buying it.
Interesting. Yeah, that is a good point. And it is quite interesting to approach things logically like that. So many
Yeah,
times
can I
people
can I just give one
talking.
more example because I know you have a lot of typically in-office device people.
Yep.
Um, I don't do this to be difficult. I think it's helpful. You can look at my reviews to see if that's the way other people think of it. When someone's talking about putting a device in a doctor's office, I say, where are you going to put it?
Yeah.
And they look at me like, what do you mean? I go, well, is it going to go on a table, on a counter? Is it going to be at the end of the hallway? Is it going to be in the coffee room?
Does it work with
Where's it going to
flow?
go in the office? Because that talk to a doctor, that really matters. The nurse is going to have to line up and wait to use a machine, right? And those things are means that if you can answer that question, it means you talk to your customers.
Mhm. So and this may be a little bit tied back specifically to devices or diagnostics, even digital health.
Same
Companies
thing.
who have some sort of pilot experience, how advantageous do you find that, and what are the important metrics that you think companies who have piloted should look to get across in their pitch?
So right, piloting for a device, a diagnostic, or digital.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if I believe the data because they tend to be highly selected, right? And again, it could be an in-law. Um, or a family, an immediate family member. I've seen that too. But I think what you want to do is not so much prove that, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum. That's not interesting. What's interesting is that you have been in the office
Yeah.
or you have been in the hospital and you understand the workflow. And so to me, that's where the pilot data comes from, is if it's a digital health app, how does the doctor get the patient to take it home? And who does the training? And the patients are not as facile as the people on this call are with technology. So what do you do when grandma doesn't know how to turn the device on or doesn't know how to connect it to the phone, right?
Yeah.
My sister's the same age as I am. She doesn't know how to use an iPhone.
Mhm.
Okay. And
How do you
and
then approach that situation when the patient doesn't know how to use it?
yeah, and so it's sort of the closer you are to the other 3Ds, right? Sort of, but not the drug part, because then it's the physician saying, take this, go to the pharmacy, and you live forever. Anything else, just remember that the folks on this call are in the top 10%, of the educational level in the country, maybe higher than that. And we all know how to use technology, but the vast majority of the patients don't. And they're not anywhere near as healthy as we are, right? They're dealing with hypertension and obesity and congestive heart failure. You pick it, they've got it. And you have to step outside yourself, which is why spending time in a doctor's office or in a hospital really, really matters. And you can talk intelligently about it, even without statistically significant data from your own experience.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of that discussion point really ties back into, again, that bottom point, even though we haven't named it by name yet, but having a long-term strategy, and always having the patient and the use case and the workflow in mind. Um, for companies who may not have that data available or have it at all, what are some short-term or near-term strategies that show that even though they don't have that data and that proof of concepts point yet, that they're still going in the right direction?
Um, there's increasingly good literature about how people are going to use products. So, a company I'm with, we do a lot of work in addiction, and there's a ton of published stuff about, you know, people who care about public health are doing research, and they can tell you with pretty strong accuracy what percentage of, opioid overdoses are witnessed by third parties, right? So you can pull that stuff off the internet. Um, Absent that, you have to go talk to people hypothetically about what it is that you're selling and ask them what they think about it, right? And that applies to cancer drugs too,
Yeah,
right? Because um, someone's going to have to persuade an oncologist to switch from standard of care to something new.
which is a big ask. Very
Hmm?
big. So, which is a very big ask for
It's a
most people.
big ask, particularly if the protocol means they have to see you outside the routine therapy, right? So, for example, chemotherapeutic agents have all been designed to be in 2 week intervals or 3 week intervals. And if you've got a new drug that's at a 5 week interval, you're going to have to explain to me how you're going to get an oncologist to schedule that visit.
Mhm.
Because the answer most times is they won't.
Yeah. Awesome. So I got a few more questions on the topic if we haven't already covered it. But how do investors react when companies gloss over that? Um, when they don't choose to show that information, what is the reaction and what information are you then looking to hear or have expected to hear?
At a pitch contest, somebody on the panel will, at a RESI pitch contest where the investor is actually allowed to ask questions, and
Mhm.
not all investor conferences let you do that, somebody will ask.
Yeah.
In my experience, they always do.
Yeah. So I know we had just discussed the importance of if you don't have that information, show that you have a plan to get it. Um, how do you do so in a way that isn't speculative? Um, if you're obviously you can't make assumptions based off of, oh, I'm predicting this response. Um, so what are ways that companies can make a prediction outside of literature, to then show that vision?
I hate to say this, you just have to do the work. You got to pick up the actual telephone and call people and say, you got to call 100 of them to get five people to agree to listen to your 10-minute pitch over the phone and say, what do you think? Or you can get really, really sick on purpose and then find yourself in a hospital. And well, they're asking, literally, I did that. Well, I didn't do it on purpose, but I had surgery last year. I got to ask all the nurses what kind of drugs they like for pain.
Yeah.
It was great. And I get to try a lot of them too. So I had firsthand experience. Um, but I'm serious. You gotta. When I was at Baxter years and years ago, we used to just go talk to nurses because they're easier to talk to than doctors, and ask them what their experience is and what do they like and what do they think. And when a medical professional can't understand what it is you're selling, it's time to rewrite your selling pitch.
Mhm. And so this brings me to the next portion, which I think is one of the most important parts of the pitch, is the investor questions. Um, and so we put 7 minutes of investor questions. It's 6 minute to pitch, 7 minute of Q&A. And the reason we put such a high emphasis on the investor Q&As because it's arguably the most important part. It gives investors the chance to ask what exactly they're thinking. And oftentimes they'll look to dive into a little bit more depth on technology, the market or competition if you didn't already address it specifically enough for them. Also, again, that second point that you had mentioned earlier is how do you make money? So if there's any reimbursement, what is the path to exit? And then again, if you haven't covered the management team at all, how do you do so? Um, I am curious, Bruce, how in depth do you like to see companies go with their use of funds? We always recommend a Gantt chart in which it shows, especially if you're going to tranche around, if a company goes in and they say that they're raising X amount, to be able to show exactly what that gets you. Um, how in depth do you think companies need to go when there may not be a specific answer?
Um, so I have a slight, Max, I have a slight bias against Gantt charts because I think they're very hard to see on a screen, right? And you don't know when you're going to a pitch contest that everybody's going to have as sophisticated an IT team as Resi does. So you might wind up in a room where you're projecting on a screen and nobody past the first row can actually see the type
Yeah.
because Gantt charts tend to be busy. So I like to see those in a written deck. They're not my favorite thing. And bear in mind, at Resi, your judges are looking like this over their shoulders because of where you put the chairs, trying to see a screen at like a 45-degree angle. So I think it's a little hard to do complicated slides like that. I think you want to say a simpler, I've seen people do line charts that have valuation on one axis and cash raised and milestones and stuff like that. To me, for a pitch contest where you got 6 or 7 minutes, that's good. That says to me, for $10 million, this is what I get. For the next round is $30 million, and that's where I get. And if you want to put exit comps on, that's just gravy. It's a good thing to have. But more detail than that, I think, is a diligence question, not a pitch question, because I want to know if you're going to spend $30 million to get to an inflection point or $300 million to get to an inflection point. And obviously that depends on where you are in space, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think the biggest of this list here, and I think this is a terrific list, is the biggest pitfall that I see is reimbursement, right? Regulatory is regulatory, right? And then you're going to get into political discussion. Is there anybody home at the FDA this month, right? And the new center heads at Cedar and Seaber, do they have the right? You want to get into discussion about do they have the right experience to do what they're supposed to be doing? You're going to get lost in the politics of Trump and Kennedy. But reimbursement is nothing to do with them, really. It has to do with will the carriers pay? And it's not obvious, but I think um, we're moving to a world of higher and higher deductibles and copays. So I think it's now important to have some thought as to what percentage of the whatever you charge is going to wind up coming out of pocket of the patient.
Yep.
And in devices and diagnostics, diagnostics in particular, since most carriers have folded them into the deductible. So an enormous number of diagnostics are now technically covered, but actually self-paid, right? Because if you're relatively healthy, you don't get to pass the deductible, so you're out of pocket.
Mhm.
So I think you need to talk about what's going to make the carrier want to pay for it, especially if it's a device or diagnostic where they don't have to, right? And some people don't really understand the difference. If it's your company, you know the difference, obviously. But those are hard questions about, um, have you thought about the economics of a substantial portion of the patients who self-pay? What do you do about people who are increasingly uninsured? And it's not political to say there are going to be a lot more uninsured people 3 years from now than there are today. Those kinds of things I think are increasingly important. With drugs, less so,
Mhm.
right? The issue with drugs is, the carriers are now saying Wegovy and Zepbound are the same thing, and so they're putting one on the formulary and one not. And that's a whole new wrinkle in reimbursement that you have to think about, that the carriers and Medicare, for that matter, are basically defining equivalence in ways they didn't used to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've got a few more questions for you before we maybe turn it over to the audience for some Q&A. These are from both your investor hat and your company hat, but related specifically to IPC and RESI. So my first one is based on what you've seen, how should companies think about tailoring their pitch specifically for IPC compared to other pitching competitions or even a just investor meeting? Obviously, outside of just less time, what are some of the key differences there?
So I think RESI, and I'm not just saying this because you pay me a lot of money to do this hour, Max, is RESI is one of the few conferences that I go to where I take feedback from investors and from people pitching, and you see subtle changes in the structure of RESI from year to year, and I really do applaud you guys for doing that, and I give Dennis a lot of grief, but the Resi format has gotten better over time, and that's why it's attracting more investors and better pitches. And I think the expansion of time to the Q&A is a big thing for two reasons. One is that I think it's really useful, but also you get to decide how to split that time up. In reality, they're not going to, you know, cut your mic off if you're in the middle of your story and you got to take an extra minute to tell it. So you have good flexibility, and I think you should think about that. If you just you can cut me off, Max, but if you just can't get your story out in 6 minutes and you need seven when you've rehearsed it, take the seven.
Mhm.
The moderator will tell you you're over time and it's going to come out of your Q&A, but that's a choice you get to make.
Yeah.
And don't the nice thing about Resi is you're not forced to rush if you need to say something that's really important. Don't take the whole time because then people will be really angry at you and nobody will ask the questions and the judges will get mad.
Yeah, we do give a little bit of wiggle room. So
Yeah,
I have to be the bad guy and often cut people off, but it's not by the second. It's typically we'll wait for you to finish your thoughts.
yeah, and I think it's a really useful format. And I think it is different because Resi insists that the judges be there and ask good questions. And I think you don't get invited back if you don't.
Yeah.
So you really have to prepare for questions, which at a lot of other conferences you don't. They
Yeah.
just,
And
it's
and
good
we like
questions and
tough
people get up
questions.
and leave. Yeah.
We like tough questions. If you're not accustomed to answering tough questions, you that's probably where you should start in your investor outreach, because as you progress in the diligence and meet investors, they only get tougher. So we invite tough questions.
Right. And if people, right, this is the hardest thing I do on both sides is um, sometimes the judges are finishing up their comments from the last pitch, or sometimes they're just distracted and they'll have missed something really important you said. There's a lesson in that, which is you didn't say it loudly enough or clearly enough, or it got buried in a story. So even the so-called dumb questions are really useful because that means you thought you said something that nobody else heard.
Yeah, interesting. And so I know we've covered a lot, but if you could summarize it in one sentence and say you've seen both strong and weak pitches, what do the top IPC companies do that others don't?
The person who's pitching smiles and they actually talk to the audience, not to the screen.
Mm,
Um, and they are they get that balance of being knowledgeable without being arrogant.
yeah,
So it's all about the pitch
and the
and the
presentation.
comfort you have in knowing that you know what you're talking about without being condescending. And that you get to the point early so that the first 2 minutes I've made up my mind if I care. And then the other 4 or 5 or 6 minutes are, man, I want to learn more about this. And
Hmm.
that those are the winning pitches. The
Yeah.
worst thing you can do is wait till the end for the reveal. Everybody hates that. And I will say, I think now Resi has the best format of anybody in the business, and the most helpful staff. So if you're going to pitch, pitch at RESI. And I don't get a commission on that. I
Well,
should, but I don't.
well, thank you, Bruce. Finally, before we turn over to the audiences, for any companies who may be on the fence, whether it is a technical or a big strategic answer, what is your advice to them who are on the fence
Do,
about pitching at IPC?
do it. And I don't say that to everybody. There are places I just think are a waste of time and money.
Yeah. Well, we certainly enjoyed having you both on the webinar and pitching with us in June. I'm gonna scroll up here and see if there are any questions from the audience. Please, you can type them in the chat and we can go ahead and ask Bruce. Well, Bruce, I think you may have done an excellent job answering everything.
All right, scared everybody away?
It, well, awesome. If there's any other final words of wisdom that you want to kind of give to us, whether it's about Buckle, Zariah, Resi, IPC, you name it, Bruce. Um,
Oh, yeah, that's too much opportunity. So, if anybody on the call has money, you can invest in Buckle Therapeutics. It's gonna be a big winner in the drug device combo space. To be more serious, I gave Max my Zariah email address. Feel free to reach out. Please, in the subject line, reference this call. Otherwise, it will just look like another cold call that I get now about a dozen a day. So make sure if you want to follow up this conversation, you want to talk to me, please reference this call because otherwise I don't get to see who's on, right? I just see the declining number of participants, which means it's my turn to exit stage left. Um, but feel free to reach out with dumb questions. I don't, I'll try to answer them because I owe the guys at Resi a bunch of favors, and I'm happy to do that if it would be helpful.
awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Bruce, and for everyone. I've included both Bruce's email up here as well as mine. So if you have any questions for Bruce and Zariah, or if you have any questions about Resi Boston September, please feel free to reach out. Well, Bruce, thank
Yeah.
you so much again. This was really insightful, and we will be sharing the recording and slides with everyone.
Yeah, don't miss Resi in September. I think it's the best one of the year, usually.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you there too.
Okay. Hey, thanks for listening, and thanks for the people who stayed on the whole time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.